Welcome to the Faith Together podcast from the Center for Faith and Family at Olivet Nazarene University. If you believe that passing down Christian faith is essential for the next generation, you are in the right place. Enjoy conversations with guests who are faith practitioners, parents, caregivers, pastors, counselors, and many more. You'll enjoy practical tools and community for passing down Christian faith to your children and grandchildren.
Hi, everybody. Lindsay here. Welcome back to the Faith Together podcast. Just a reminder that the podcast you're about to listen to is part 2 of our final conversation in the series, Moving Forward by Looking Back. We're so glad that you've joined us today and hope that you enjoy the episode.
So they do also talk about the adding of things. And these are these intentional habits, right? About how do we form a Christian character. And what I would probably want to start with saying is that they have an end in mind, but they never kind of thought like that's going to come quickly. That we're going to be this fully formed Christian and always making these wonderfully great, responsible decisions. They tended to think like, hey, we're on a really, really long journey that we're going to walk through, and we have to have patience if we're the mentor with somebody who's just coming into this, of just patiently walking them through. So the phrase Rome wasn't built in a day, right? It does kind of stand there for them.
It applies.
Definitely. And so for them, the idea was as we're starting out, our goal is to kind of get some of the standards of the Christian community and build habits that support those standards. So some of the ones that we oftentimes see them talk about, the need for humility, the need to be truthful, and this is the hard part, even when it might cause you loss. It's super easy to be truthful, right, when there's nothing at stake. But when there's something that can be potentially lost, then it gets a little bit harder. Charity towards the poor is another one. They very much preferenced nonviolent responses, and they're living in a culture where they are facing periodically a lot of violence. And then they would also talk about unity across cultural lines, that we develop habits to intentionally be with those who are not like us, and to see them as people who are made in the image of God, and therefore as people whose lives matter to God and therefore ought to matter to us as well.
So you've listed for us some of the things that they had to kind of remove from their lives as new Christians, new followers of Jesus, and things that they needed to add to their lives. It sounds to me like having a sheet of paper here with the do's and the don'ts on it, like there's this list of do's and don'ts. Is it more than that? Yeah,
I mean, sometimes it sounds like that, like here's the check sheet, just be humble. Like, could you ever actually check that one off? I don't know. But I would probably say that there's a couple of bigger considerations for them than just kind of here's the list. I think for them the list is helpful. You should be doing things because they're illustrations of this is what the Spirit is doing in our lives. And so that if we're living out this Christian life, that these are the things that we're going to be seeing, perhaps somewhat similar to in Galatians when Paul lists the fruits of the Spirit. I don't know that that's necessarily a checklist, but that here are things that your life ought to be evidencing. So yeah, they do have lists, but they're for illustrative purposes rather than here, check off these boxes. And I think for them, there is the sense that the Spirit can guide us then for areas that our illustrations don't cover. So that we're not being guided by a list and we're not trying to follow a list, but that this is a list of things that the Spirit is doing in all Christians.
And I think that's really good, Mark. And I think that's a challenge for parents today in that maybe I start with my young child with all the do's and don'ts so they begin to develop those kind of habits, but then eventually getting them to the point that they're able to make decisions for themselves on what is good and what is not good for my walk with the Lord, what would be pleasing to Jesus. That transition, I think, for parents, Lindsay, can be difficult at times.
Absolutely.
Having the rules and then trusting that I've been faithful enough in my teaching the kids about the rules by which we live that now they're capable of making wise decisions on their own.
Yeah, it's remembering that we don't have control of our child's faith, their choices, their decisions down the road, but we can create an environment that they can see God through our lives and through our imperfect journeys as we model following him, and they can see and experience God through the teachings and through what we share with them. And then the rest of it is, theirs to take ownership of. Of course, we're still guiding and helping and giving discernment and wisdom as needed. But that is very true, Leon. I think that it can be really difficult to let go at those certain points when we need to, but that's how we begin to own our faith and begin to grow those muscles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think part of that then is also giving the reasons for the rules. I mean, who of us is happy when our boss comes to us and says, "I want you to do this because I told you to"? Right? There's not a sense of ownership on that at all. It's just the boss is telling me I have to do this. But when we start to have those whys, where you started the podcast,
yes,
Leon,
start with why.
Right?
Yes,
that we start to find them being able to take that ownership and to then be able to apply the whys into other things that maybe those rules don't cover.
Right, and we're not saying that spiritual formation happens by accident. That's not what we're saying at all. It does take quite a bit of intentionality,
right? Yeah.
That we have to be pouring into it, and we have to be giving it time, just like we would any other type of learning in our life.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is a journey.
It is a journey.
Yeah, a long journey maybe, and maybe not always an easy journey.
Right. Yeah, it can be hard to let go of some of those things that you're comfortable with and that have maybe even had a lot of meaning to you. And then it can be hard to add in some of these things. Like you think of some of the things on the list and you're like, ooh, that would be nice if we didn't have to do that one.
So Mark, does it seem like there was a sense that this not only was a long journey, but it really was going to be a difficult journey for these new believers?
Right. Yeah. There's a deep sense that this is a hard road. This is not a road that at least in the early church they thought was for everybody. They thought it took this 3 years, by the way, is to become a member of the church. This is not I'm a member and this is kind of my new membership class. This is 3 years of, do you really want to do this? And do we think you can? And so they did kind of really see this as this very, very difficult journey. And like one of the things that fascinates me is they write a bunch of books about patience. For the mentor, that you've got to be patient with your people. Can't expect them to get this the first time, the second time, the 20th time. It might take dozens of times for whoever this person is to actually kind of, the light came on, sort of thing.
It sounds like parenting.
It really does. Just recently, I read a quote that was from an author that was talking about this very thought of it taking time for kids, for students to come to faith and really put their own hands and feet to that. And she said that at times it's like some kids are going to have an alarm clock moment where they just believe and they know Jesus is real and they're living for him. But then others, it's building trust over time, kind of like the sun rises in the morning. It takes that time and it takes space, and both are wonderful and both are good. And so I think about that when we think about the patience for these ancient people and also for us today.
Okay, so I'm still processing through some of this. So 3-year journey to be a part of the church. So how did they understand then conversion? Because for us, it would be, I made a profession of faith. I've asked Jesus to forgive me of my sins. I'm a Christian. That's my conversion. But it sounds like maybe for these early believers, that process may have been a bit different.
Right. So probably the process is a pretty good word there, I think, Leon, that they saw conversion as a process that led to that moment. We oftentimes highlight the moment where I said the sinner's prayer, I knelt at my parents' bed, that there was a moment where that happened. Mm-hmm. For the early Christians, they saw that conversion was the entire process that got me to that place as well. So I think about it in terms of like a relationship where there was a moment where we got married, but there was a whole lot of stuff that led up to that moment. there was a moment where I asked her to marry me. And that was a long walk that happened before that could take place. Right? So there's this journey that's taking place that gets us to that moment. So they would certainly highlight, like, that moment is really important. It's crucial. It's got to be there. But there's a lot that kind of takes us from the point of being interested in Christianity to get us to the place where we're ready for that moment. And they would see that moment then as then launching us into the rest of the Christian life. So for them, it culminates with baptism, which is where they would have their creed I call it the final exam. So
right.
Have you finished your catechetical work? If you answered the questions right, yes, you have. And they would examine the lives and those kinds of things as well. But they kind of saw it as really this kind of process that leads to a conversion. And they would have us, that seasoned Christian is an incredibly important part of that. That the goal was for them to live in such a way that when the new convert looks at them, they see somebody who has experienced the things of this life, that are living this kind of sense of joy and hope, even though they're going through hard times, and that in the good times they're exhibiting that sense of thankfulness. So the sense of having a life to kind of look at and to pattern myself after was really, really important to them. And for them, I think it becomes then that we learn how to live this authentic life. They talk a lot about how we fulfill the image of God, that God has made us in God's image, and that part of that is then demonstrated in the way that we live. And so we can live in this kind of authentic way that truly is what it is to be a human, to be us. And that we're putting away the things that are preventing us from being able to be our authentic image of God, or to bear that image of God into this world. And that's why they talk so much, I think, about this character formation, that it's this continual kind of persuasive way of living. And they certainly do talk about, hey, we ought to understand what we're talking about too. So there's words and arguments that are going on, but they viewed that the convincing someone that this is the way to go was much more in terms of the life that they're modeling, instead of like, I can argue you into it. So they have a place, but they factor in a lot, but that lifestyle is really kind of where they tended to put their main emphasis.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm still processing, and I really like what you shared, Mark, and it reminds me of maybe something we should talk to our listeners about. So, for those of you who are raising children in the church, in a Christian home where you're trying to help develop these commitments to Christ within your children, the faithfulness of them, I think sometimes we push a little bit hard, at least has been my experience, in a conversion moment for these children. And this goes back to something I wrote in my dissertation, Mark, where I did quite a bit of study on children who were raised in the church, and realizing that for many of them, this conversion was a process. They loved Jesus at a very young age, but when it comes really to their cognitive abilities, they don't understand what sin is. They don't understand the significance of Jesus' death on the cross. They don't understand the need for salvation. All they know is they love Jesus because that's what they've been raised in. And for many of them, I wonder, and this is a statement that I proposed in my dissertation, which is somewhat controversial, and that is that I wonder if many children actually fall in love with Jesus long before what we would consider a conversion, where they actually pray a prayer. And I'm wondering if the question we should ask is more, does my child love Jesus, than have they made a profession of faith, or have they prayed a prayer? And so, not that the prayer is unimportant. I think kids will come to a point in their lives where if they've not prayed a conversion prayer, that they will do that because that would be the next step in the journey. But I think we should be careful of somehow discounting the journey that leads them to that moment. And so I'm hearing that a little bit, Mark, in the journey that these early Christians were on for this 3 years of, I'm learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I'm learning what it means to have patterns in my life, disciplines in my life that demonstrate that I'm following Jesus. But maybe the commitment takes place a little bit further down the road.
Right. Yeah. They did tend to have that moment later. And I get it as a parent, right? Like, if my kid has said the prayer, I got the moment, yes, and whoo, we made it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, they really kind of saw that moment as just kind of as a milestone for sure, really important milestone. But to get to a milestone, you had to walk the mile to get there. So you had to walk that, and then again, they would see that like the job isn't done at that point either.
Yeah.
Right. Like the goal is not kind of the moment; it's a part of the goal. But the overall goal is then a lifetime of following Jesus, right? So again, not just the moment, but everything leading up to it and everything coming after it is what they would see as what goes into making a Christian.
Yeah, and I think maybe I didn't express myself as clear as I'd like to, but I think it's really important as parents for us to recognize we have a lifelong journey with our children in this process, and we don't have to get anxious about the fact that my child is 7 or 8 years old and hasn't prayed this prayer yet. When it's natural, when the time is right, it will come if we're doing our job as parents.
That's right. And you can't trust something or someone that you don't know. So we need to give them time to know who Jesus is, to experience who Jesus is, whether that's through us or through their own experiences. But that all takes time, and it's hard with spiritual formation because in every other kind of learning, academic, emotional, physical, there's percentiles, there's measurables, there's things that we can see and touch that are quantifiable, and we can say, okay, they're at this journey and now we go on to the next, the next level from 2nd grade to 3rd grade, from 5th grade to 6th grade, but we can't do that with spiritual formation. It's something that takes time, takes patience, and can be accelerated for some at different points, but also can take a much longer time to develop for others. And both things, what I'm hearing from both of you is that both things are good and both things are important to recognize as we share faith.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So Mark, it sounds like conversion, they spent a lot of time getting people to conversion those 3 years, but I'm guessing that wasn't the end of the journey.
Right. Yeah. So the journey it continues on. So the idea was that now that you've kind of reached that point, you've been baptized, you're a member of the church, then you continue in the development of those habits. You continue in that character development. You're kind of at another stage of it, but it's a stage that then continues on through the rest of their lives. And so the idea was not like you've arrived. I don't think they would think maybe that anybody's ever like actually arrived, that we're all kind of at those different stages of that process. And I think to follow up on what Lindsey was talking about, like they didn't have a timetable. Like there's no like, well, you've been at it for 18 months, so you should be here. They were like, well, you might be way ahead of that. You might be way behind that. And that wherever you're at on the journey, you're on the journey. And there doesn't have to be like, well, by year 3, you should be here. That's just kind of where most people arrived at it. Some got a much accelerated track. Others were like, they're going to be here a while. And they certainly in that expected that it wasn't always going to be smooth sailing, no matter at what point of the journey you're at. All right, so they expected mistakes and they expected people to sin. Now, some of this doesn't mean they approved of sin, right? But that they accepted that as humans, we are not going to do the right thing all the time. That's why we're putting those habits in to try to move us in that direction. But none of us is going to make that, right? They understood like Jesus is the perfect one and we're not him, right? But we're called to model our life after him. And so in those places where we don't measure up, then they wanted to say, so how do we then help you move forward from that? And a lot of that is in terms of going back to those habits and reinstalling some of those habits that might have been left behind for a while.
As you've processed through all of this work that you've done, that you've shared with us, what are the take-home points for us? What are the lessons for us to learn? I mean, we've kind of hashed through some of that together here as we've interrupted your conversation and all that. But where do you land on this?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest one, right, is that as a parent, as a caregiver, that you are naturally your child's mentor in the faith. That they look to you for those examples. And again, certainly this isn't the call that you have to be perfect, that as a parent, you're going to make mistakes. And it's never a bad thing, I think, to then say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, so that your kids can kind of see that. Like, it's okay to own my mistakes. But I think within that, then, that there are certain things we can do to make sure that the mistakes that we're making might be mitigated a little bit. That some of the things that there are lots of resources that are available to help us to understand our faith, to learn how to read the Bible better, those sorts of things. So it's not a call that the fact that we can make mistakes is not a call to then say, well, then let me just go ahead and do that. But instead to say, what are the places where in my own faith journey, I'm not that clear on? And to be honest with ourselves about that and to say, then what can I do to improve in that? So some of the things that I think of is looking for equipping in certain areas. And so intentional training to give us some of those whys that are behind the what we do. So I think of things like learning how to read the Bible a little bit more, learning to look at things like historical and literary context, and looking at the words that are actually on the page, and all of those sorts of things are things that can really help us as we're kind of mentoring and helping our children to come to the faith. And again, I think that goes back to the fact that we can just tell our kids what the faith is, or we can help them to experience it.
Yeah, discovering. I love helping our kids at church to discover, and lots of times that discovering comes out of questions. And I think that's a really important thing, not just telling our kids what the answers are, but helping them to discover the answer. Boy, I could go on all kinds of stories of things that I've encountered with children at church, but I won't. So
and to walk with them as they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And to discover together.
Yeah, and in that you discover, like, I never saw that before.
Yeah, what if we thought of our kids as pilgrims on the journey with us, that together we are pilgrims on the journey, learning as we live life together. I love that imagery.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important idea. And it's the recognition, right, that I don't have it all figured out, but that there are places that I can go to move in that direction. And so to avail ourselves, right, to some of the different resources that we'll have available on the CFF website, that are available through our local church, to start making some of those intentional steps for ourselves so that we can then intentionally help our children as they're asking those questions to learn where do we go to start to find the answers rather than just being spoon-fed the answers.
Mm-hmm. Discovering those things ourselves, but not keeping it to ourselves.
Right.
Sharing it with one another, walking together in that. I think those are some wonderful takeaways in this conversation.
All right, Mark, so as we come to a point of kind of wrapping up this conversation, are there other application concepts you want to share with us that maybe we've not discussed yet?
Yeah, I think probably the one that I want to hit again is that importance of helping our children, new believers, to understand the why. Again, I think nobody is terribly happy with just an authoritarian, here's what it is, but that they want to explore, they want to discover, and that as they do that, like one of the things we've talked about multiple times together is the making my faith my own. And that's a difficult and a hard journey, especially if it's just been, here's what we do. I think when they understand the why, instead of just having it kind of dogmatically declared to them, here's what we believe, but when they can understand the why and can see kind of what the journey is and the directions that we're going and the reasons why we're going in those directions, I think that history bears out fairly well that people who understand the why are much more likely to remain in the faith than they are to leave it behind.
That's great. Thanks for that kind of summary there at the end. So, Lindsey, we've been on a journey together through this.
We have.
There's been some challenges in here. One of the things that I'm really excited about is Dr. Mark Frisius has written an article on this topic that is maybe we'll fill in some of the blanks or gaps of our conversation. When you have a conversation like this, sometimes the train of thought is sometimes hard to follow because we're jumping all over the place a little bit. But that article will be available on our website at centerff.com. So if you'd like to check that out, you can download that, or you can just read it right on the web page, whatever works best for you. And so that kind of brings us to a conclusion of this. But I want to end by saying that one of the things that we have learned through this process is that there are lots of tidbits that we can take from these early Christians that will help us as we get to really practical tools that we're going to be providing soon. So in our next series, Lindsey, we're going to be talking about some really, really stay-at-home, kind of practical things that can be done in the home.
Absolutely.
That will help parents in this journey.
Yes, and it will connect to what you mentioned earlier, discovering God in our everyday lives, ways that we can do that together.
Right. So we're thankful that you hung with us through this process. And as always, we wish you the very best. May the Lord bless you, keep you, and give you peace. You've been listening to the Faith Together podcast from the Center for Faith and Family at Olivet Nazarene University. Sign up for additional resources at centerff.com. When building faith, we are better together.